She was still wearing her wedding dress when they found the body. The white lace was soaked through with rainwater and something darker, clinging to her thin frame as she stood barefoot in the mud outside the First Baptist Church of Millbrook, Alabama. Her hands were trembling, her eyes were empty, and when Sheriff Ray Coleman asked her name, she whispered it like a confession. Sarah. Sarah Whitmore. But that wasn't the name on her birth certificate. It was Halloween night. The kind of night when the veil between the living and the dead feels paper-thin in small southern towns, when superstition runs thick as the humidity, and every shadow seems to breathe. The rain had started at sunset, a cold October rain that turned the red clay roads into rivers of rust-colored mud and made the Spanish moss hang heavy from the live oaks like funeral shrouds. The church sat on a hill at the edge of town, its white steeple cutting through the darkness like a bone. Inside, the pews were empty. The candles had burned down to nubs. And in the vestry, behind the altar where generations of Millbrook families had been baptized and married and mourned, there was blood. So much blood. Sheriff Coleman had been eating dinner with his wife when the call came through. A breathless voice on the other end. A woman screaming in the background. Something about the church. Something about a bride. He'd driven through the storm with his deputy, a young man named Marcus Webb, who'd only been on the job 6 months, and when they arrived, they found her standing in the parking lot. The bride, 22 years old, bone-thin, dark hair plastered to her face, and those eyes. Coleman would later tell his wife that he'd never seen eyes like that before, empty and full at the same time, like looking into a well that had no bottom. "Ma'am," he'd said, approaching slowly, the way you'd approach a spooked horse. "Ma'am, are you hurt?" She didn't answer, just stared at the church doors, which stood open, revealing nothing but darkness inside. "Where's your husband?" Coleman asked. That's when she smiled. A small, terrible smile that made the sheriff's blood run cold. "He's waiting for me," she whispered. "He's always waiting for me." Deputy Webb had gone inside first, his flashlight cutting through the gloom. The church smelled like candle wax and flowers and something underneath, something metallic and wrong. The pews were arranged perfectly. The hymn books were stacked neatly. Everything was in its place except for the silence, which felt too heavy, too complete. The vestry door was ajar. Webb pushed it open with his boot, his hand on his weapon, and that's when he saw it. The scene that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The scene that would cause 3 veteran police officers to request transfers out of Walker County within the month. The scene that would make hardened investigators weep. A man lay on the floor dressed in a dark suit. His eyes were open. His throat had been open too, a clean cut from ear to ear, precise and deliberate. The blood had pooled around him, soaking into the floorboards, spreading out in dark fingers that reached toward the altar. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what was written on the wall above him, painted in his own blood, in handwriting that was almost beautiful in its careful precision. "Till death do us part" was always a lie, and beneath it, a single word that would become the key to everything: brother. Millbrook, Alabama was the kind of place people drove through on their way to somewhere else. Population 2,847. 1 main street, 3 churches, a diner that served breakfast all day and closed by 8 at night. The kind of town where everyone knew everyone, where secrets were currency and reputation was everything. The Whitmore family had lived there for generations. Their house sat 3 miles outside of town, down a winding dirt road that disappeared into the pine forest. It was a large house once, beautiful even, built in the years after the Civil War when cotton money still meant something. White columns, wide porches, gardens that had once been the envy of the county. But by the autumn, the house had fallen into decay. The paint was peeling. The gardens were overgrown. The windows, once bright with lamplight and life, stood dark and empty, like eyes that had seen too much and decided to stop looking. The locals called it the Hollow House, though no one could quite remember when the name had started or why. It just fit. There was something hollow about it, something vacant and wrong, like a shell of a thing that had once been alive. Thomas and Sarah Whitmore had grown up in that house, brother and sister, 2 years apart in age. Thomas was the older one, tall and handsome in the way that Southern boys are, with dark hair and darker eyes, and a smile that could charm the birds from the trees. Sarah was smaller, quieter, with pale skin and that same dark hair that fell past her shoulders like a curtain she could hide behind. Their mother had passed when Sarah was 12. Cancer, the town said, though there were whispers that it was something else, something that had nothing to do with disease and everything to do with the slow poison of living in that house with that man. Their father, James Whitmore, was a veteran. Korea. He'd come back different, the way men from that war often did, with nightmares that made him scream in his sleep, and a temper that made his children learn to walk quietly through their own home. He worked at the lumber mill and drank at the Pine Ridge Tavern, and attended church every Sunday with his Bible in one hand, and his children walking 3 steps behind him. To the outside world, they were a respectable family. Tragic, perhaps, with the loss of the mother, but respectable. No one knew what happened behind the closed doors of the Hollow House. No one knew about the locked rooms and the forbidden hallways. No one knew about the punishments that left no visible marks. No one knew about the way Thomas would stand outside Sarah's door at night, listening, protecting, the only barrier between her and their father's rage. No one knew that protection could twist into something else entirely. That love could become possession. That family could become prison. The town started to notice something strange about the Whitmore siblings when they were teenagers. They were always together, always, walking to school side by side, sitting together at lunch, Thomas's hand on Sarah's back, guiding her through doorways. Sarah's eyes always searching for Thomas in a crowded room, finding him, relaxing only when she did. "Those two are closer than most married couples," Mrs. Henderson at the general store would say, shaking her head. "Ain't natural," her husband would reply. "Brother and sister shouldn't be that close." But the whispers never became accusations, because in a town like Millbrook, you didn't speak ill of people to their faces. You saved it for after church, for the beauty parlor, for the back booth at the diner where the coffee was strong and the gossip was stronger. Thomas graduated high school and got a job at his father's mill. Sarah finished a year later and started working at the library, a quiet job for a quiet girl. They still lived at the Hollow House with their father, though James Whitmore was drinking more now, coming home later, caring less about what his children did. That's when people started to see them at odd hours. Driving down dark roads at midnight, sitting in Thomas's truck at the overlook where teenagers went to park, walking through the woods behind their house, hand in hand, disappearing into the trees like two ghosts fading back into the world they came from. "You think they're?" people would start to ask, then stop, because some questions were too ugly to finish. The answer, of course, was yes. But the truth was so much worse than anyone imagined. Sheriff Coleman stood in the vestry, staring at the body, at the blood, at those words painted on the wall. Deputy Webb was outside with the bride, trying to get her to speak, to explain, to say something that would make sense of the senseless. But Sarah Whitmore wasn't talking anymore. She sat in the back of the patrol car, still in that ruined wedding dress, staring at nothing. When Webb asked her questions, she would smile that small, terrible smile and whisper the same thing over and over. "He promised we'd be together forever. He promised." Coleman called for backup, called for the coroner, called for anyone who could help him understand what he was looking at. Because this wasn't just a death. This was a message. This was a declaration. This was love gone so wrong it had turned inside out and become something else entirely. As he stood there in the candlelight, with the rain hammering on the roof and the blood seeping into the floorboards beneath his feet, Sheriff Ray Coleman realized that he was standing at the edge of something dark and deep and utterly incomprehensible. He was standing at the edge of the Whitmore family secret, and before this was over, that secret would tear Millbrook, Alabama apart. The coroner arrived an hour later, a gray-haired man named Dr. Ellis, who'd been doing this job for 30 years. He examined the body in silence, his face growing paler with each passing moment. Finally, he stood up and looked at Coleman with eyes that had seen too much death to be shocked by it anymore. Except now they were shocked. "Ray," he said quietly, "there's something you need to see." He pulled back the dead man's sleeve, revealing his left wrist. There, carved into the skin with what must have been a knife, were two initials: S.W. Sarah Whitmore. "That's not all," Dr. Ellis continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Look at his ring finger. There was a wedding band. Simple. Gold. Engraved on the inside with a date and two names. Thomas and Sarah. Forever." Sheriff Coleman felt his stomach turn. He looked at the body again, really looked at it, and saw what he should have seen from the beginning. The resemblance. The same dark hair. The same angular face. The same features that marked all the Whitmores, that ran through that family like a curse. This wasn't Sarah's husband. This was her brother. And somewhere in this church, somewhere in this terrible Halloween night, was the answer to a question Coleman didn't want to ask. What kind of love ends like this? What kind of love begins like this? The rain continued to fall, washing nothing clean. The first time Thomas Whitmore realized he loved his sister the wrong way, he was 17 years old. It was a summer night, humid and thick, the kind of night when the air itself feels alive and pressing against your skin. Sarah was 15, sitting on the porch swing in a white cotton dress, her bare feet pushing against the wooden planks, making the chains creak in the darkness. She was reading by the light of a kerosene lamp because their father had cut the electricity again, punishment for some imagined transgression neither of them could remember. Thomas had come outside to escape the sound of James Whitmore's snoring, the whiskey-soaked breathing that filled the house like poison gas. He sat down next to Sarah, and she leaned against him the way she always did, her head fitting perfectly into the curve of his shoulder. "Read to me," he'd said, and she did. Her voice soft and melodic, reading poetry she'd borrowed from the library. Keats, Byron, words about love and death and beauty that ached. That's when it happened. That's when Thomas looked down at her face, illuminated by lamplight, and felt something shift inside him. Something that had always been there, dormant, waiting. Something that felt like falling and flying at the same time. He kissed the top of her head. She stopped reading. The silence that followed was heavy with understanding, with recognition, with the terrible knowledge that they had both been feeling this thing, this impossible thing, and now it had been named. "Thomas," she whispered, and there was fear in her voice, but something else too. Something that sounded almost like relief. "I know," he said. "I know." That was the summer everything changed. Sheriff Coleman sat across from Dr. Ellis in his office as dawn broke over Millbrook. Neither man had slept. The coffee was cold. The ashtray was full. And between them lay the pieces of a puzzle that neither wanted to complete. "Tell me what you found," Coleman said. Ellis rubbed his face with both hands, the gesture of a man trying to wake from a nightmare and finding he cannot. The victim, Thomas Whitmore, age 24. Cause of death is exsanguination from a severed carotid artery. The cut was clean, professional almost. Done with a very sharp blade, probably a straight razor. Time of death, I'd estimate between 8 and 9 p.m. last night. "Halloween night," Coleman said quietly. "Yes, Halloween night." Ellis paused, choosing his words carefully. Ray, there's more. The body shows signs of ritualistic preparation. He'd been bathed recently. His clothes were new, probably purchased specifically for this occasion, and there were flower petals in his pockets, orange blossoms. Wedding flowers. Exactly. Ellis pulled out a photograph, sliding it across the desk. And look at this. The photograph showed Thomas Whitmore's chest, his shirt opened. There, carved into the skin over his heart, was a symbol. A circle with two interlocking rings inside it, and at the center, a cross. What is it? Coleman asked. I don't know, but it was done post-mortem, which means Sarah did it, after he was already gone. Coleman felt sick. What about the girl? What did Webb get from her? Nothing coherent. She keeps talking about promises, about forever, about how love isn't supposed to end. Ellis leaned forward. Ray, I need to tell you something. Something I probably should have told you years ago. Coleman looked up sharply. What? About 6 months back, maybe 7, Thomas Whitmore came to see me. Private consultation. He wanted to know about genetic counseling, about the risks of children born to close relatives. The words hung in the air between them like smoke. He was planning this, Coleman said slowly. He was planning to have children with his own sister. It appears so. I told him it was impossible, illegal, that I couldn't help him with something like that. He thanked me politely and left. I thought that was the end of it. Ellis's voice cracked. I should have reported it. I should have done something. What could you have done? Being in love with your sister isn't illegal. It's just… Coleman trailed off, searching for the word. Evil? Ellis supplied quietly. I was going to say tragic. The interrogation of Sarah Whitmore began at 8 a.m. She sat in the small room at the Walker County Sheriff's Department, still wearing that blood-stained wedding dress, though someone had draped a blanket over her shoulders. Her hands were cuffed to the table. Her face was expressionless, smooth as porcelain, beautiful in a way that made Coleman uncomfortable. Deputy Webb stood in the corner, taking notes. Coleman sat across from Sarah, a tape recorder between them spinning its reels, capturing everything. Miss Whitmore, Coleman began, can you tell me what happened last night? She looked at him with those empty eyes. We got married. You and your brother. Yes. The casual way she said it, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, made Coleman's skin crawl. Walk me through it. From the beginning. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Then she began to speak, her voice soft and dreamy, as if she were describing a pleasant memory instead of a nightmare. Thomas came to my room at sunset. He was wearing his suit. The one he'd been saving. He told me it was time, that we'd waited long enough, that tonight we would make our promises real. What promises? The ones we made to each other when I was 16. After Daddy. She paused, and for the first time emotion flickered across her face. After Daddy hurt me, Thomas found me in the barn. He held me while I cried. And he promised that he would never let anyone hurt me again, that he would protect me, that we would always be together. Coleman felt his chest tighten. Your father hurt you? He hurt both of us, but especially me, because I looked like Mama. He said I looked like Mama and it made him angry, made him remember. Sarah's voice remained calm, detached, as if she were talking about someone else. Thomas was the only one who understood, the only one who saw me, really saw me. So last night, we went to the church. Thomas had prepared everything, the candles, the flowers. He'd even written vows, beautiful vows. He said them first, and I repeated them back to him. I take you as my husband, my brother, my only love until death and beyond. And then what happened? Sarah's eyes focused on Coleman for the first time, and what he saw there made him want to look away. There was no madness in those eyes. No confusion. Only a terrible, crystalline clarity. "Then I gave him his wedding gift," she said simply. "The razor. The straight razor that belonged to our father. The one he used to threaten us with when we were children. Thomas had always been afraid of it, but I promised him that if he let me use it, if he trusted me with it, then it would never hurt him again. It would set him free." Coleman felt his hands shaking. "Sarah, are you telling me that Thomas asked you to do this? That he wanted you to end his life?" She smiled then, that small, terrible smile that would haunt Coleman's dreams for years to come. "He didn't just ask, Sheriff. He begged." The story that emerged over the next hours was one of the most disturbing cases Coleman had ever encountered, and he'd been a lawman for 23 years. According to Sarah, the relationship between her and Thomas had started innocently enough. Sibling affection that ran deeper than normal, yes, but nothing that crossed any lines. Not at first. But James Whitmore's treatment of his children had created a twisted dynamic in the Hollow House. He would pit them against each other, punishing one for the perceived failures of the other. He would lock Sarah in the basement for days at a time, and Thomas would sneak down to sit outside the door, talking to her through the wood, keeping her sane. When their mother died, the abuse escalated. James drank more, raged more, and Thomas became Sarah's only refuge, her only source of comfort in a world that had become unbearable. "He would hold me at night," Sarah told Coleman, her voice never wavering. "When the nightmares came, when I couldn't stop shaking, he would climb into my bed and hold me and tell me stories until I could breathe again." "And that's when it became physical?" Coleman asked, trying to keep the judgment from his voice. "It was always physical. He was my brother. But it became something else. Something we both knew was wrong, but neither of us could stop. Because it felt like the only right thing in a world full of wrong things." The relationship had continued in secret for 6 years. They were careful. They never showed affection in public beyond what siblings might. They never talked about it, even to each other, except in whispered moments in the dark. But recently, something had changed. James Whitmore had died. Heart attack. Dropped dead at the lumber mill on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 months ago. And suddenly, Thomas and Sarah were free. Free from him. Free from the violence. Free from the fear. But freedom, Sarah explained, brought a new kind of terror. Thomas started talking about leaving, she said. About going somewhere else. Somewhere we could be together openly. Get married under false names. Have a life. A real life. But you didn't want that. I wanted it more than anything. But Thomas, he was starting to feel guilty. The nightmares were getting worse. He would wake up crying, saying he'd ruined me. That he'd made me into something twisted. That everything we had was built on sickness. Sarah's composure began to crack, just slightly. Hairline fractures in the porcelain. He started talking about ending it, about separating, about him leaving and me staying here, living a normal life, finding a normal man, having a normal family. Her voice dropped to a whisper. As if I could ever be normal after him. As if any other love could ever compare. So the wedding was his idea. One last time, he said. One last perfect moment before we said goodbye forever. He would marry me properly, the way we'd always dreamed, and then, Sarah's voice broke, and then he would end it. He would leave, and I would be alone again. Coleman leaned forward. But that's not what happened. No. Sarah looked down at her hands, still stained with her brother's blood. When he said his vows, when he looked at me with all that love and all that guilt and all that pain, I realized something. If he left, he would die anyway. Slowly, piece by piece. The guilt would eat him alive. The loneliness would destroy him. So you decided to do it quickly. I decided to do it perfectly. Sarah looked up again, and there were tears on her face now, but her voice remained steady. I told him I had a gift for him. A way for us to be together forever, the way he'd always promised. No more guilt. No more fear. No more having to choose between loving me and hating himself. And he agreed? He cried, Sarah said softly. He cried, and he held me, and he said yes. He said if it was my hands that did it, if it was my love that carried him away, then maybe he could be forgiven. Maybe we both could. The room was silent except for the spinning tape recorder. He sat down on the floor, Sarah continued, her voice taking on a dreamy quality again. He tilted his head back and closed his eyes, and I stood behind him, and I put the razor to his throat, and I whispered, "I love you," into his ear. And then I gave him his freedom. Coleman felt bile rising in his throat. The words on the wall, the symbol, the ring. The ring I carved the day Daddy died. Thomas wore it every day after that. The words, Sarah smiled sadly. Death was never meant to part us. That was the lie everyone else believed. We knew better. We knew that death was the only thing that could make us whole. And the symbol? 2 souls, 1 circle, forever intertwined. That's what we were. That's what we'll always be. By noon, the story had spread through Millbrook like wildfire. The Whitmore siblings, the forbidden relationship, the wedding that ended in blood. People gathered in clusters on Main Street, in the diner, outside the church, speaking in hushed, horrified tones. Some called it evil. Some called it insanity. Some called it the saddest thing they'd ever heard. The First Baptist Church was closed indefinitely. The vestry sealed off as a crime scene. Reverend Matthews, who'd presided over that church for 30 years, resigned immediately, unable to reconcile what had happened in his sacred space. And at the Hollow House, deputies searched room by room, finding evidence of the relationship that had shocked the community. Letters, photographs, journals filled with Thomas's tortured confessions, and Sarah's desperate declarations of love. In Sarah's room they found a wedding dress, carefully preserved, that she'd sewn herself over the course of months. In Thomas's room they found the razor which he'd taken from his father's belongings the day after the funeral, and a note explaining what he wanted done with his body. He wanted to be buried in the family plot next to his mother. He wanted Sarah to be buried next to him. He wanted them to be together in death, since life had made it impossible. But that decision wouldn't be Sarah's to make, because Sarah Whitmore was under arrest for deliberate homicide. And Walker County, Alabama still had very strong opinions about justice. Late that evening, as Coleman drove home through the dark, he passed the Hollow House one last time. It stood empty now, its windows like vacant eyes, its porches sagging under the weight of too many secrets finally revealed. And he thought about 2 children, trapped in that house with a monster, finding comfort in each other. He thought about how love could grow in the darkest soil, twisted and strange, but still somehow genuine. He thought about the fine line between protection and possession, between devotion and destruction. He thought about Thomas Whitmore, who'd loved his sister so much it destroyed him, and Sarah Whitmore, who'd loved her brother so much she'd set him free the only way she knew how. As the Hollow House disappeared in his rearview mirror, Sheriff Ray Coleman whispered a prayer. Not for justice. Not for understanding. But for mercy. For the kind of mercy that only God could provide, because this world sure as hell wasn't going to. The trial of Sarah Whitmore lasted 3 days. 3 days that felt like 3 years to the people of Millbrook, Alabama. 3 days during which the tiny courthouse on Jefferson Street became the center of a media storm that descended on their quiet town like locusts. Reporters from Birmingham, Atlanta, even New York crowding into the gallery, their cameras flashing, their microphones thrust into the faces of anyone who would talk. And everyone wanted to talk. Because the story had everything. Forbidden love, family tragedy, violence wrapped in ritual, the kind of darkness that people couldn't look away from, even when they desperately wanted to. Sarah sat at the defense table in a plain gray dress, her hair pulled back, her hands folded in her lap. She looked small, fragile, nothing like the blood-soaked bride who'd stood in the rain that Halloween night. Her attorney, a young public defender named Michael Chen, who'd drawn the shortest straw in Walker County legal history, sat beside her, looking increasingly desperate as the prosecution built their case. Because it was an easy case to build. Sarah had confessed, had described every detail, had shown no remorse, no understanding that what she'd done was wrong. She'd taken her brother's life with a razor and called it love. The prosecution called it premeditated ending of life. The defense called it mercy. The jury would have to decide which truth they believed. The prosecution's case was presented by District Attorney Robert Harrison, a man who'd been waiting his entire career for a case that would make his name. He was in his 50s, silver-haired, with the kind of commanding presence that made juries pay attention. He called witness after witness. Dr. Ellis, who described Thomas's injuries in clinical detail. Deputy Webb, who testified about finding Sarah in the parking lot, covered in her brother's blood. The crime scene investigators who'd cataloged the evidence in the church. But the most damaging testimony came from people who'd known the Whitmore siblings. Mrs. Henderson from the general store took the stand and described how Thomas and Sarah had been unnaturally close for years. How they'd come into her shop holding hands. How Thomas would touch Sarah's face with a tenderness that made Mrs. Henderson uncomfortable. "It wasn't right," she said, her voice trembling. "The way he looked at her. It wasn't the way a brother looks at a sister." The librarian, Miss Caroline Porter, testified that Sarah had checked out books about running away, about starting over in new places, about marriage laws in different states. "She asked me once," Miss Porter said quietly, "if two people who loved each other very much could get married even if their families didn't approve. I thought she meant she had a boyfriend her father didn't like. I told her that love should triumph over prejudice." The elderly woman's voice broke. "I had no idea what she was really asking." And then there was James Whitmore's former co-worker, a man named Dale Hutchins, who testified about the night James had gotten drunk at the Pine Ridge Tavern and started talking about his children. "He said they were unnatural," Hutchins recalled. "Said he'd caught them once when Sarah was about 16, in Thomas's room. Door locked, both of them half-dressed. He said he beat Thomas so bad the boy couldn't work for a week, but it didn't stop nothing. Said they just got sneakier about it." The courtroom erupted in whispers. The judge banged his gavel. Sarah never flinched, never looked away. She sat perfectly still, as if she were watching a play about someone else's life. Harrison built his case methodically, painting a picture of two individuals who'd crossed every moral boundary, who'd lived in secret sin for years, and whose relationship had inevitably led to violence. "This wasn't mercy," he told the jury in his closing argument. "This was possession." Thomas Whitmore wanted to leave, wanted to end their inappropriate relationship, and Sarah Whitmore, unable to accept that, decided that if she couldn't have him in life, she would take him in death. This is not love, ladies and gentlemen. This is control. This is selfishness. This is taking a life, and that is against the law, no matter how you try to dress it up. The jury nodded along. The reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks. And in the back row of the courtroom, Sheriff Coleman sat with his head in his hands, knowing that Harrison was both completely right and completely wrong. The defense had an impossible task. Michael Chen knew it. Sarah knew it. Everyone in that courtroom knew it. But Chen was young and idealistic, and he believed that every defendant deserved a vigorous defense, no matter how hopeless the case appeared. He called a psychiatrist from Birmingham, Dr. Rebecca Moreno, who'd examined Sarah extensively over the past weeks. Miss Whitmore suffers from complex post-traumatic stress disorder, Dr. Moreno testified, the result of years of severe physical and psychological mistreatment at the hands of her father. This trauma began in childhood and continued until his death just months ago. And how did this trauma affect her relationship with her brother? Chen asked. Thomas Whitmore was her only source of safety in an extremely dangerous environment. He was her protector, her lifeline. In a very real sense, he was the only reason she survived her childhood. Dr. Moreno paused, choosing her words carefully. When you're trapped in that kind of situation, when one person is all that stands between you and destruction, your attachment to that person becomes complicated, intense, often inappropriate by normal standards. In your professional opinion, did Sarah Whitmore understand that what she was doing was wrong? She understood that society would judge it as wrong. But in her internal framework, shaped by years of trauma and isolation, her actions made perfect sense. She was preventing suffering, keeping a promise, honoring what she perceived as her brother's wishes. So she's not responsible for her actions? Dr. Moreno hesitated. That's not for me to say. What I can tell you is that Sarah Whitmore's perception of reality has been fundamentally altered by her experiences. She doesn't think like someone who grew up in a safe, normal home. The prosecution tore Dr. Moreno apart on cross-examination. Harrison made her admit that Sarah had planned the ritual carefully, that she'd known it would result in Thomas's passing, that she'd had the capacity to choose a different path. Trauma is not an excuse for taking a life, Harrison said firmly. Millions of people experience difficult childhoods. They don't become criminals. Chen also tried to introduce evidence of James Whitmore's treatment of his children. Medical records showing broken bones. Teachers' notes about bruises. But the judge ruled most of it inadmissible, saying the trial was about Sarah's actions, not her father's. In his closing argument, Chen made an emotional plea. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm not here to tell you that what Sarah Whitmore did was right. I'm here to tell you it was human. She's not a monster. She's a deeply damaged young woman who confused love with survival, who couldn't tell the difference between helping someone and harming them, because no one ever taught her the difference. He gestured to Sarah sitting so still at the defense table. Look at her. Really look at her. She's 22 years old. She should be planning a future. Instead, she's the product of a childhood that none of us can truly imagine. Thomas Whitmore was all she had, and when he told her he was going to leave, when he asked her to help him end his pain, she did what she'd always done. She tried to save him. She just didn't understand that you can't save someone by ending their life. Chen's voice broke on the last words. I'm asking you for mercy. Not because she deserves it, but because understanding deserves it. Because compassion deserves it. Because sometimes, the law needs to recognize that human beings are more complicated than guilty or not guilty. It was a beautiful argument. It didn't matter. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. Sarah sat in the holding cell beneath the courtroom, staring at the concrete walls, humming softly to herself. The tune was familiar to the deputy guarding her, though he couldn't place it at first. Then he realized it was a hymn. Amazing Grace. The same hymn that had been playing in the First Baptist Church that Halloween night. When the bailiff came to bring her back to the courtroom, Sarah stood without being asked and held out her wrists for the handcuffs. She moved like someone in a dream, floating through the corridors, up the stairs, into the courtroom where her fate awaited. The jury filed in. None of them looked at Sarah. That's when Coleman knew. Has the jury reached a verdict? The judge asked. The foreman, a middle-aged farmer named Ed Patterson, stood. We have, Your Honor. What say you? We find the defendant, Sarah Ann Whitmore, guilty of premeditated taking of life in the first degree. The courtroom exploded. Reporters rushed for the doors. Someone in the gallery started crying. The judge banged his gavel repeatedly, calling for order. Sarah didn't react. She simply looked down at her hands, at the scars on her wrists that matched the ones Thomas had carved into his own skin. And she smiled that small, terrible smile. Because she'd known all along how this would end. Sentencing was scheduled for 2 weeks later. The prosecution asked for life imprisonment without possibility of parole. The defense asked for psychiatric commitment instead of prison. The judge, a stern man named Harold Winters, who'd presided over Walker County courts for 20 years, listened to both arguments. Then he looked directly at Sarah. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "do you have anything to say before I pass sentence?" For the first time since the trial began, Sarah spoke. Her voice was soft but clear, carrying through the silent courtroom. "Your Honor, I don't regret what I did. I know I'm supposed to. I know that would make everyone feel better. But I can't lie. Not about this." She took a breath. "Thomas was in pain. Every day of his life, he was in pain. And he asked me to help him. He trusted me to help him. How could I say no to the only person who ever loved me?" "Miss Whitmore," the judge began. "I don't expect you to understand," Sarah continued. "Nobody here understands. They see something evil, something wrong. But they didn't live in our house. They didn't feel what we felt. They don't know what it's like to have one person be your entire world, and then have to watch that person suffer." She looked up, her eyes meeting the judge's for the first time. "I helped him. I freed him. And now I'm ready to follow him. Because that's what we promised each other. Together, always. Until death and beyond." The courtroom was dead silent. Judge Winters closed his eyes briefly, as if praying for wisdom. When he opened them again, his face was grave. "Miss Whitmore, what you describe as love, the law describes as taking a life. Regardless of your intentions, regardless of your brother's requests, you ended a human life. And this court cannot allow such actions to go unpunished." He paused, and in that pause, Coleman saw something flicker across the judge's face. Sadness. Regret. The recognition that justice and mercy are not always the same thing. "I hereby sentence you to life imprisonment in the Alabama State Women's Prison. You will be eligible for parole after serving 25 years. The gavel fell. Sarah nodded once, as if the judge had simply confirmed something she'd already known. As the deputies led her away, she turned back one last time and spoke to the courtroom, to the reporters, to everyone who'd come to watch her fall. "He's waiting for me," she said. "On the other side. And when my time comes, we'll be together again. That's all that matters. That's all that ever mattered." Yet, then she was gone, disappeared through the door that led to the holding cells, to the transport van, to a life behind bars that she would endure with the same quiet grace she'd shown throughout the trial. Because Sarah Whitmore was patient. She could wait. She'd been waiting her whole life. The weeks after the trial were strange ones in Millbrook. The reporters left, chasing the next tragedy, the next scandal. The courthouse went back to handling speeding tickets and property disputes. Life resumed its normal rhythm, or tried to, but something had changed in the town. An innocence had been lost. A darkness revealed. The hollow house stood empty, slowly surrendering to the kudzu and the elements. No one wanted to buy it. No one even wanted to look at it. It became a place where teenagers dared each other to go at night, where ghost stories were born, where the line between truth and legend grew increasingly blurred. Thomas Whitmore was buried in the family plot next to his mother, despite protests from several community members who felt he didn't deserve a Christian burial. The funeral was attended by exactly 4 people: Sheriff Coleman, Deputy Webb, Dr. Ellis, and Reverend Matthews, who'd come out of his retirement to say a few words over the grave. "We are not here to judge," Matthews said, his voice trembling. "That has already been done, by courts higher than ours. We are here to acknowledge that a life has ended. A complicated life, a troubled life, but a life nonetheless. It was raining again, just like it had been that Halloween night. The rain fell on the fresh-turned earth, washing everything clean, or trying to. In the Alabama State Women's Prison, Sarah Whitmore was processing into her new life. She was given a uniform, a cell number, a list of rules. She followed all instructions without comment. The intake officer noted in her file that the prisoner seemed unusually calm, almost serene. That night in her cell, Sarah lay on the thin mattress and stared at the ceiling. She traced the scars on her wrists, the ones that matched Thomas's, and she whispered into the darkness, "I'm here, Thomas. I'm still here. Wait for me." And in the silence of the prison, in the stillness of the night, she could almost hear him answer. "Always," he seemed to say. "I'll always wait for you." Sheriff Coleman retired 6 months later. He told everyone it was because he'd reached retirement age, because his wife wanted to travel, because he'd earned his rest. But the truth was simpler and sadder. He couldn't stop thinking about the Whitmore case. Couldn't stop seeing Sarah's face. Couldn't stop wondering if there had been a moment, any moment, when someone could have intervened and changed the trajectory of that doomed relationship. On his last day, he drove out to the Hollow House one final time. He sat in his patrol car, engine idling, and stared at the decaying structure. And he thought about how many other houses in Walker County, in Alabama, in America, held similar secrets. How many children were suffering behind closed doors? How many bonds were being twisted into something unrecognizable by cruelty and isolation? How many tragedies were waiting to happen? He thought about writing a report. Recommendations for social services. Better training for teachers and doctors to spot signs of mistreatment. Programs for at-risk youth. But he knew it wouldn't matter. Because some things are too deep, too dark, too complicated for any system to fix. Some wounds never heal. Some loves never die. Some ghosts never rest. As he drove away from the Hollow House for the last time, Coleman said a prayer for Thomas and Sarah Whitmore. Not a prayer for their forgiveness. Not a prayer for their punishment. Just a prayer for their peace. Whatever form that peace might take. 25 years later. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon in late autumn. The warden at Alabama State Women's Prison, calling to inform the Walker County Sheriff's Department that Sarah Ann Whitmore had passed away in her sleep the night before. Natural causes, the warden said. Heart failure. Peaceful. She was 47 years old. The current sheriff, a woman named Jennifer Martinez, who'd been a teenager when the Whitmore case happened, listened to the information and made the appropriate notes. Then she asked the question that protocol required. Did she have any next of kin to notify? No, the warden replied. No family. No visitors in all the years she was here. There's a note in her file requesting that she be buried in the Millbrook Cemetery, family plot, next to her brother. She'd been saving her commissary money to cover the costs. Martinez felt a chill run down her spine. After all this time, she still wanted to be with him. According to her cellmate, the warden said quietly, she talked about him every day, said he was waiting for her, said they'd made a promise. The funeral was small. A handful of curious townspeople, a few reporters who remembered the case. And Sheriff Martinez, attending out of a sense of duty to history, to her predecessor Coleman, to the strange, sad story that had marked Millbrook forever. Sarah Whitmore's casket was simple pine, per her instructions. It was lowered into the ground next to Thomas's grave, which had weathered 25 years of seasons, the stone worn smooth by wind and rain. The priest said generic words about rest and peace. No one eulogized Sarah. No one spoke about her life. There was nothing to say that hadn't been said in the trial, in the newspapers, in the whispered conversations that had echoed through Millbrook for a quarter century. As the small gathering dispersed, Martinez stayed behind, looking at the two graves side by side. Brother and sister, lovers, criminals, victims. What were they really? She thought about the file she'd read preparing for this day, about two children trapped in a house of horrors, about love that grew in toxic soil and became something twisted and strange, about a promise kept, even unto taking a life, about patience that lasted 25 years, waiting for a reunion that might never come. The wind picked up, rattling the leaves of the oak trees that surrounded the cemetery. And in that wind, Martinez could have sworn she heard something. A whisper, a sigh, the sound of two voices, finally reunited. Or maybe it was just the wind. She turned and walked back to her car, leaving the Whitmore siblings to whatever peace they could find. The hollow house burned down the following spring. No one knew how it started. Some said lightning. Some said teenagers with matches. Some said it was spontaneous combustion, the house finally giving up its hold on the physical world. By the time the volunteer fire department arrived, there was nothing to save. The house burned hot and fast, as if it had been waiting for this moment. As if it had been holding its breath for decades and could finally exhale. The fire burned through the night, visible for miles. People gathered on the road to watch, standing in clusters, speaking in hushed tones about the Whitmores, about that Halloween night so many years ago, about the trial and the verdict, and the years that followed. By dawn, nothing remained but ashes, and the stone foundation. The columns had fallen, the porches had collapsed. Even the earth around the house seemed scorched, as if the fire had burned away not just the structure, but the memory of what had happened there. The land was never developed. The county eventually took possession of it for unpaid taxes, but no one wanted it. It became overgrown with kudzu and wild roses, slowly disappearing back into the forest, becoming a story instead of a place. And the story of Thomas and Sarah Whitmore became a legend. A cautionary tale told to warn children about the dangers of isolation, of family secrets, of love that grows in the wrong soil. A Gothic romance that ended in tragedy, a crime that was also somehow a mercy. Depending on who told it, the Whitmores were monsters or martyrs, criminals or victims, sinners or saints. The truth, as always, was more complicated than any simple label could capture. But one thing everyone agreed on: theirs was a love that defied understanding. A love that broke every rule. A love that ended in blood and ashes and promises kept beyond the grave. And sometimes, on October nights, when the wind blows cold through Walker County, when the rain falls like tears from a grieving sky, people swear they can see two figures walking hand in hand down the old dirt road that used to lead to the Hollow House. Brother and sister, together at last, forever and always, just as they promised, just as they always knew they would be. The end.